Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Thoughtful Software Podcast. My name is Fahad, and joining me always is Andrew Wolf, CEO of SkipList. This podcast is about building great and incredible software, thoughtful software. The reason is that in the software industry, unfortunately, there's just so much waste. Billions and billions of dollars a year are wasted on projects that are basically unusable. And we believe there is a better way, and this is thoughtful software. So, in this episode, Andrew and I talk about software architecture and why it's so important to your business. Fundamentally, building and having a great architecture will enable your business to achieve greater success than having something that's kludgy and doesn't work quite right, is not scalable. So we're going to talk about some of the things that you could do and consider as you build, your platform or mobile app. We'll also talk about some of the mistakes that some companies make when building an architecture, what you could possibly do about it. Hopefully you'll find it informative. So here we go. Okay, Andrew, so why don't you tell us what is software architecture?
Yeah, absolutely. So software architecture, I think, can be defined very simply, and that is business enablement. Now, business enablement is a weird term because when you think of open source or any of those types of technology, you look at it from a perspective of, well, what is the business open source is in? And it still is business enablement. And I'll give you an example. So Kubernetes is an open source piece of software that's really popular right now. It's enabling people to be able to run Docker containers. That's their business that they're enabling. And if they are able to build software inside Kubernetes and build out Kubernetes to continue to enable their mission, then they're therefore enabling their business. And so when you think about software architecture for a private enterprise, like SkipList, are you enabling the mission of the company, right? If your mission is to organize the world's information, Google's mission, if your architecture, your software doesn't allow us to build software and write additional enhancements to the piece of software that's doing it for that mission, then your software architecture is what I would call bad architecture. But if you have built the right architecture, then when I go to write software inside the ecosystem that you built your architecture, I should be able to do it easily and achieve the mission. That's a good architecture.
Do you find like senior architects understand this, or is it just about experience? Just years in software. Like where do you draw the line in terms of when you can use a junior or a senior architect?
Yeah, so I think a seniority in software is about fitting more of the system in your head. And what I mean by that is as you get more senior, you've seen more systems. And so you're able to fit more of them in your head because you build the right abstractions. So, for example, when someone says a credit card payment system, a junior person may get lost in the details of the credit card payment system. But a senior person might say, oh, okay, so parts of the credit card payment system, because I have an abstraction in place because they've worked on these before. You have the encryption for the credit card numbers, you have the interaction with the payment transaction, the Visas, the MasterCards of the world, and all of that. So I can actually just have that as a box in my head that I know what's inside the box. And so that I can fit more of the system in my head at a higher level. And I think that's the real difference between a junior and a senior architect and when to use them. I mean, if you have a very simple system that you need an architect, a junior will do just fine. But if you're looking at like an enterprise class architecture with hundreds of potential systems, you're going to want someone a lot more senior to look at that to fit more of the system in their head so they can make better decisions on technologies and where to put what in the architecture.
That's really interesting. Well, let's define also what is software design. I mean, the way I see it, that software architecture, maybe you could say it as what we're building, and maybe software design is how we're building it. What is your take?
I think you're nearly right there. So the architecture is how things communicate and interact and how they look together as a system. And the design of that may be, you're talking about maybe the entire architecture, but you might be talking about a singular component inside of the entire architecture.
Maybe
So
it's more
design,
tactical, right?
yeah, it's a lot more tactical when you think about it, but it can be a lot more strategic, right? I think designing is a activity and architecture is the overall like map, if you will, of what we're going to build. And so it's a thing versus an activity, a noun versus a verb at the end of the day.
Hmm. Well, when you're kind of getting started in a project, everybody has this like requirements gathering phase, and you lay out what are the challenges, what are we trying to build, how do you incorporate like this idea of thoughtful architecture? I mean, what does it mean to be thoughtful in architecture?
So thoughtful architecture, in my opinion, is looking at the system and building the simplest system you can. And thoughtfulness is down to the last system, right? Not building a credit card system that accepts all the payment types up front, but maybe only accept one because that's all you need to get the job done. And building the simplest system that everyone can build on, but also considering the greater mission and the ecosystem you're operating with. And at the same time, right? So maybe I'm architecting this enterprise system. I need to be thoughtful about the people that are going to operate within the architecture. So what are the skill sets of the engineers in the organization? The product managers, what are they going to ask me to do 6 months from now, a year from now, 6 years from now? Good architecture lasts a long time. And then really thinking about all those details and coming up with a system that solves for those, that's being thoughtful. And it's more than just business enablement in that case. I said at the beginning, it depends on what business you're in. Maybe you're in the business of people, and so being thoughtful is thinking about the people. Maybe you're in the business of building and developing new products for customers, product management, then it's thinking about product and really considering everybody when you're building and architecting systems.
Well, let's get a little bit more detail. Let's bring up this. So you talked about a credit card system. Describe maybe the thought process you would have about, the architecture of building something like that.
Yeah, so being thoughtful here, I would look at, well, who is going to operate on this, right? The US system is thoroughly different than the European system. So if I have a mixed continental team, some people in like Belgium, for example, and some people in Ohio, for example, your team, I might think about differing systems and who works on what, right? And how we're building out, say, the credit card number system so that people can rationalize it in their head a bit better. On top of that, when we think about credit card processing from a product perspective, what does now look like? Well, now, chip and pin has become annoyingly pervasive here in the United States. That system never works for me. Put my card in, it's like, please wait. And then the machine starts screaming at me, right? So you have to think, well, that's now. What does the future of credit card payment look like? Right? When I look at the future, are we going to have credit cards at all? I mean, there are a lot of people out there, some of them really crazy, that tell you that Bitcoin's going to replace credit cards here in like 2 years. You just wait.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I don't think so either. But if you ask the right person, they'll tell you that cryptocurrency is the future, man. And like,
So
this is the hard.
So do you build in so how do you account for that? I mean, the architecture you're building for today, you have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow.
So you build the abstractions in the right place. There's a thing by Martin Fowler, who's one of the better enterprise architects in the world. He's written quite a few books. And he says, abstract what changes, right? So what is going to change? And that's part of being thoughtful, right? Like what is changing? What is dynamic? Physical cards, Apple Pay, that's a big change, like people paying with their NFC chips. And you have to really look at what has changed the most in the history of the credit card industry from a product perspective and an engineering perspective. For example, security standards have only gone up. So when we're talking about abstractions we need to put in the architecture, we think of security has to be one of them. We have to be able to upgrade our security system at a moment's notice. Because if, for example, Amazon gets breached tomorrow, right? I hope they don't, because I think the FBI is going to listen to this and be like, that guy did it. But if they get breached tomorrow, we're
just a bunch of software guys trying to make money, man. FBI doesn't care.
Now you made it worse. They're like, oh, just some software guys trying to make money. They breached Amazon. But if they get breached, the security things are going to go through the roof. And so we have to look at that. That's going to change. We have to look at the way credit cards are used. Are they going to be physical cards? Probably not. I think we're going to go more towards the digital space. People are going to use their phones more. They're going to use their watches. Hell, like AirPods, you might be able to pay with your AirPods here pretty soon.
You can pay with your watch already, right? So that's kind of
yeah,
cool.
It's crazy where we're going. And so you have to think of those abstractions and really pull those out of the system so they can change and you can adapt to a rapidly changing world, an increasingly digital and increasingly sophisticated, if you will, right? Our credit card systems are way more sophisticated even over the course of the last 2 years. Remember when Target was breached, really put a lot of pressure on the credit card companies, Visa, MasterCard, to push towards the chip and PIN, right? That was a dramatic shift and it happened extremely fast. And if you weren't prepared for it and you didn't have the right abstractions in your architecture, you were stuck, maybe not being able to process payments anymore as of last year. So it really puts stress on making sure that you can change. And if you put the right abstractions in your system, you ease the pressure and the timing and the cost of changing your system.
Okay, so adding in abstractions to your architecture is one thing, but you and I run into projects where over the last 10 years, companies have patched, features and things like that to systems where, and now 10 years later, it's just a piece of garbage. And you run into this problem where there's now security issues, there's code incompatibilities. What's the danger of not patching things correctly or doing things the right way? What is the better proper way to do that?
So I always see startups do this a lot more than enterprises. Enterprises tend to have a lot less urgency in their process. With some asterisks there, I've seen some pretty urgent enterprise projects in my time. They start out small and it's just one thing at a time. And you have to take a step back and nothing's ever one thing. And there's a good analogy for this. Imagine every time you add a patch, you're swiping your card for $25,000, right? And this card has like $1 million limit and it's crazy awesome because you're a baller, Fahad, and you have $1 million credit card. I don't have $1 million credit card.
I got the black card. The black card.
The black card. It's awesome. So every time you were making those patches, you're asking your guys to do it, you're swiping your card for $25,000. And eventually, what happens if you don't pay that card off? You hit your limit. Now you can't do anything anymore. You can't make changes anymore. You have to start paying down that debt. Well, American Express is at your door asking for their $1 million. Where's my money, right? But that's the same thing with your customers. Where's my feature? Where's this thing? Why aren't you improving? And so thinking of it as actual debt you're taking into your organization and saying, can we accrue this debt? And most of the time is you can, but if your card's maxed out, you can't. And so how do you prevent that? Good testing strategy, right? Being able to say, okay, we're going to automate this. We're not going to automate that, but make conscious decisions where you put the debt and the risk at in your system. It's fine to have a really messy component of your system if it never changes, right? Maybe you have a algorithm that isn't going to change because it's a baseline, simple. It's the Pythagorean theorem calculator, and that theorem's not going to change anytime soon. That's fine to be messy. But if you have a core component of your system that changes constantly, like your core competency of your company or your your bread and butter, you're going to want to make sure you wrap that with tests and that you're going to make sure it's well factored, right? That the system's broken into the right components that make it testable and also is tested. That's how you get out of it. You spend the time to do it right. You don't just spend the time to do everything right, but you have to be very conscientious of where, if you will, thoughtful, where you put the risks, where you put the dirt. Every system has technical debt. If you tell me your system has technical debt, I'm going to assume you never shipped it and that you don't have any customers, right? And so if every system in production has technical debt, it's where you put it and how you've shielded the organization from it that matters the most.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So you and I were talking to a customer I think a few weeks ago where they're looking to, transfer into a new kind of like shipping system. And we were talking to the individuals on this project and they didn't really understand what was going on, what was happening in the past, or what were the past systems. So how important is documentation? I think that has a lot to do with building thoughtful architecture, and making sure that you can stack and add new features.
Absolutely. Documentation is huge. So when you think about what documentation does, it does two things. When you write something down, it sticks. And two, it exposes flaws. So if you take 45 paragraphs to explain one subcomponent in your system, that subcomponent does too much, right? That means that thing's a bottleneck and it's a failure condition waiting to happen. Versus a system that I take 4 sentences to describe, that's probably an okay component, right? Ideally, I say if it takes more than a sentence to tell me what your component does, it's doing too much, right? So the single responsibility principle from object-oriented programming applied across everything to architecture, right? You want to do one thing and do it really well. And if it does one thing and I can describe it to you, then that means that system is low risk. It's not, when something breaks and it's that thing, you know exactly where to look to fix it. But it's not likely to break because it's easy to get one thing in your head and know what it should do and do it.
But why is there so much poor documentation in the industry? I mean, we run across this so much. What the heck, man? Let's just put a document together.
It's hard to write documentation, right? Like I didn't go to school for writing. I went to school for computer science. And so, yeah, did I take some writing classes? I did because I knew the importance of communication, but not everyone does that. And so not only is writing difficult, when you're up against a timeline, the first thing that gets cut is documentation. The second thing is testing. The third is quality of the code, the proper factoring, right? And almost all of those get cut all the time because the proper estimates weren't done on the architecture. That's a different topic for another time. But the actual, people don't value documentation, but I feel if we did, we'd have a lot more successful projects. And I think we'd have more successful handoffs and maintenance of the projects.
I mean, but it's the same thing where, writing high quality code. I mean, there's one thing of writing the right commands, but then also making the code look nice, the right indentations and comments. You would, as a developer, want to have someone understand your code, but we run across a lot of just badly written code, not just functionality, but it's just, not properly written. Again, it goes back to, proper documentation, proper code writing, just etiquette and thoughtfulness. And so is it just because of schedules or is it just, I don't know. What is it? What is your take?
I think there's a lack of craftsmanship in our field in general. That I take pride in the work that I do. And so I think of it like, let's say I was building a house, right? I would make sure all the boards lined up, that it was up to code. And I would do all that because when someone went to live in that house, I would take pride that someone used the thing I built. And so good code for me is about having that pride and saying, someone's going to look at this one day and I don't want them to hate me.
I guess we should be clear, though. We're not poo-pooing on the entire industry. There's some phenomenal software developers. You, one included, our team, and many that we've met throughout our time that, they are very thoughtful in what they do. But I think what you're describing is one of our core values is, simple over complex.
Absolutely. So I'm not crapping on the industry. The industry's fine. I always say too that you can never do something you weren't taught to do. And so if your mentor never valued those things, you may never value them either. And so all I'm asking for is people to mentor more, take more out of their time to learn, right? We talk about learning a lot at Skipless because it's so important to us to expose ourselves to different ideas. And so that we can have better ideas ourselves, but also so that we know better. Like there's a lot of industry experts out there that care about this stuff. And the industry in itself is a nascent industry. I mean, in its current form, our industry's been around for about 30 years, right? People were doing punch cards before that. So it's very new field and we're still figuring it all out. It's not as rigorous as say mechanical engineering or electrical engineering. It's been around a lot longer. and a lot of those norms have already formed. So we're still in that, norming stage of an industry, and we'll get there. So no, it's I don't think it's we're trending in the right direction. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. But I think with Skip List, one of my missions for us is to help that trend and move it along and show people this is what software is about. It's about craftsmanship, about, like you said, simple over complex, about these values, and to learn from us. And hopefully we can learn from the industry too. There's a lot of good things that we don't know, right? We can't know everything, but if we have that mindset of helping each other out, I think we'll get there quicker than, not helping each other out.
So we've discussed a lot about software architecture, and we know that if you're not careful, your project could get very complicated. And so some of the simple things you could do is have proper documentation and think more about the future. This for sure will help reduce some of the friction and challenges down the road. You also have full-time employees to worry about, as well as consultants and vendors, and you got to make sure all that meshes together. So how do you put this all together so you do get incredible and usable software?
So I have a saying that if I can't convince you of my idea, it might not have been a good idea to begin with, or I have a communication problem. So the way I always like to sit down ends up being a partnership, right? We partner with our customers because we care about their problems. We care about the people that work there. That's who we are as a company. And if you have an outside vendor, you clearly value them too. And so as far as I'm concerned, they're a partner. And so we need to sit down, and they may know things we don't know. They could have been there for years before we got there and know about all the successes and the failures of the current projects and previous projects. And they can help us navigate the domain a little better. And so when we're talking about architecture and we're thinking about it, there are a lot of factors that go into it. As I said, just about being thoughtful. And as I mentioned, there are domain, people, the software itself. Having additional people, additional mindshare can never hurt. And yeah, architecture is super important. And should it ever fall down to one person, I think everything should be one person making the final call. But it should be a collaborative effort. And if that's outside people, internal people, we bring in external contractors all the time that are experts in their field and to help us collaborate and think about the problem at a deeper and more involved level. So I look at outside contractors as a different perspective than ours to help us build a better architecture, not as competition, not as someone to push to the side and ignore.
Well, let me ask you your opinion on just say cloud services. Let's get maybe specific so we can help some of our listeners.
So in my experience, AWS is the most complete solution. I liken it to, there's a saying maybe 10 years ago, no one ever got fired for picking Microsoft. And then 10 years before that was no one ever got fired for picking IBM. I'm surprised no one ever got fired for AWS in the thing yet, but I'll make it a thing. It's such a complete solution, and you really can't go wrong with it. Now, where it falls down is with Azure and Google Cloud Platform. They've taken a different approach. AWS is, we have everything. You just have to figure out how to use it. Azure and GCP, Google Cloud Platform, really took an approach of, we'll tell you how to use our thing. We'll be very prescriptive with it, and it'll do most of the things you want to. So you'll see approaches like we wrote our own machine learning vision algorithms so you can just incorporate that. We wrote our own speech to text platform so you can incorporate that. Whereas with Amazon, they're kind of like, here's a machine learning thing. You train your own models and we'll figure out how to go from there. I really like Google's approach of being developer first, and I think they've done a great job with their developer tooling. And I really like Azure's approach to the enterprise. Their enterprise support contracts, it's Microsoft. They're incredible, right? They have incredible support. If I'm working with a client right now that uses Azure, and whenever I need anything, they're like, yeah, absolutely, we'll help you, Andrew. And they on the phone and they're running commands with me in the command line, and it's incredibly helpful. And so it really depends on what we're looking for. From a cost perspective, GCP wins every time. From a network speed, and Google has the fastest network by a considerable amount. You have to look at what you're aiming for, the sophistication of the organization you're working with, and what's going to give them the best bang for their buck. If you're a huge enterprise and you're already working with Microsoft, Azure is a great platform, right? If you don't have a cloud, but you have a lot of complex needs, AWS is probably the platform to go to. If you're looking for a developer-friendly solution and that's what's going to get you out of bed, GCP is the way to go. But with anything, you have to look at the problem at hand and figure out what are your exact needs and then pick the platform that's best for that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of enterprises that are reluctant to go to the cloud. They still have their own private networks. What do you say to enterprises that are in that kind of mindset?
I say if it's good enough for Amazon, and it's good enough for Google, and it's good enough for Microsoft, it's probably good enough for you. That said, there's a lot that goes into it. If you're a hospital and you're HIPAA, you need to be HIPAA compliant. AWS just became HIPAA compliant last year. You may hold off for a little longer. If you're just a regular enterprise and you're worried about your customer security, I wouldn't be too worried about it anymore. There's a lot of great security around clouds, and most of the organizations that have their own cloud are running in their own cloud, using their own services and dog fooding it. I wouldn't worry about it too much. But once again, that's if you're hesitant, really look at why you're hesitant, and if it's cost. There's a lot of great, Skipless does it too, consultants that will help you get across the finish line and get it into the cloud, right? If it's security, what about the security scares you? Maybe pull someone in for a day and ask them all your questions about the cloud and really understand it a bit better.
I think it's security. I think it's more of ownership. I work for a German company. They had their own internal cloud service. Or they had their own private network, and it took them forever just to even have their own private cloud. They wouldn't dare put any company information on a AWS or Google Cloud or anything like that.
You really have to look at it and understand the business case of why you would need the public cloud, and also not just why you might need it, what it can enable for you, right? And so if you're not using Google Docs, but you have a collaboration problem, maybe go and use a collaborative doc solution, O365, Google Docs, and that might solve a huge problem you have for a cheap price point.
Thanks for listening to the Thoughtful Software Podcast. You can always check us out at skipless.com. All right, talk to you next time.